And now we have Tina Minkowitz from the Center for the Human Rights of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry.
Thank you. I'm going to speak about the standards that justify a legal conclusion that forced psychiatry amounts to torture and other ill treatment. I will also make concrete recommendations for the committee with regard to Article 15. Like my colleagues on this panel, I am a survivor of forced psychiatry, and I bring this perspective with me as a human rights lawyer. I have advocated and written about forced psychiatry as torture beginning during the ad hoc committee which elaborated the CRPD. The Special Rapporteur on Torture adopted many elements that I brought forward, both in the 2008 report of Manfred Novak and in the 2013 report of Juan Mendez. There are many nuances that would merit discussion, and I will provide the committee and others with a list of references. The list in my presentation will be posted on chrusp.org resources page. The first Special Rapporteur on Torture, a Mr. Koijmans in 1986, included in a list of physical forms of torture the administration of drugs, including, and this is his quote, neuroleptics that cause trembling, shivering, or contractions, but mainly make the subject apathetic and dull his intelligence. Neuroleptics are the drugs known as antipsychotics. They are used extensively in psychiatric institutions and are the kind of drug most commonly used against a person's will. Researcher David Cohen documents that there's no specific antipsychotic effect to neuroleptics. They have the same effects on any human being or animal, a profound dampening of the central nervous system, as well as many associated uncomfortable physical and mental sensations. There is a good summary of the harm caused by neuroleptic drugs in a shadow report that was submitted to the Human Rights Committee on the United States, and I include that in my list for further reading. After the CRPD was adopted by the General Assembly, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights convened an expert meeting on torture in people with disabilities and invited the Special Rapporteur on Torture and other torture experts of the UN to attend. This was in 2007. I gave a presentation in that meeting along with several others from civil society, and the result was the 2008 report of Manfred Novak. In addition to being one of the first UN actors to acknowledge that the CRPD prohibited involuntary treatment and involuntary confinement, Novak adopted a standard similar to one that I proposed during the elaboration of the CRPD. In his version, quote, medical treatments of an intrusive and irreversible nature without a therapeutic purpose or aimed at correcting or alleviating a disability may constitute torture or ill treatment if enforced or administered without the free and informed consent of the person concerned. Note a few things. He says medical treatments of an intrusive and irreversible nature, and elsewhere in the report he refers particularly to electroshock, psychosurgery, and administration of mind-altering drugs as reaching this threshold. Without a therapeutic purpose or aimed at correcting or alleviating a disability, it's a disjunctive or, and the standards should not be collapsed. This is significant because both Novak and Mendez, as torture rapporteurs, reject the idea that medical necessity is a justification for acts of discrimination against people with disabilities, including forced treatment. The standard of aimed at correcting or alleviating a disability. This politicizes forced treatment from a disability perspective as being an assertion of what I think it was Teresia at some point this session called the terror of normalization. In other words, people with disabilities have a right to be as we are and not to have our minds and bodies made over to suit other people. We alone have the right to decide whether a medical treatment will support who we are or detract from who we are, and that is why free and informed consent is the essential requirement. I'd now like to address the criteria for torture under Convention Against Torture Article 1 as applied to forced psychiatric interventions. There are specificities for each of the component acts of forced psychiatry and variations from one circumstance to another, but general features can be outlined. First, what are the acts we are talking about? 1, detention, involuntary hospitalization or institutionalization for any period of time in a mental health facility or social care institution. This detention is unjustified and it causes substantial harm. And the detention really encompasses all of the other aspects of the violation as well. 2, forced treatment with invasive measures like psychosurgery, electroshock, and mind-altering drugs, including neuroleptics. Also, any forced psychotherapy or correctional therapy. 3, restraint, which can be physical restraint or chemical, in other words, the use of drugs as restraint, for any period of time in the context of mental health services or in response to psychosocial disability. 4, solitary confinement, also for any period of time. And 5, other acts of torture and ill treatment that are associated with or occur in psychiatric institutions and mental health services, such as strip searches and body cavity searches, degrading and inhuman living conditions like excessive heat or cold, unpalatable food, clothing that doesn't cover the body or forced nakedness, rape and assault by other staff or other residents or detainees, etc. Now to the criteria for torture. This is under Convention Against Torture, Article 1. It must be 1, intentional, 2, an infliction of severe mental or physical pain or suffering, 3, by or with the acquiescence of a public official, 4, not inherent in lawful sanctions, and 5, for purposes such as obtaining a confession, coercion or intimidation of the person or someone else, punishment of the person or someone else, or for reasons based on discrimination of any kind. So I'm going to take those in order. Intent under CAT Article 1 is considered to be the general intent to do the act and not a specific intent that the victim experienced suffering. This is significant since medical professionals, as well as others who commit acts amounting to torture, may deny that their purpose was to cause the victim to suffer. The Special Rapporteur on Torture considers that acts of discrimination based on disability, including forced treatment, satisfy both the elements of intent and the element of purpose. 2, infliction of severe mental or physical pain or suffering. My colleagues have documented the kinds of suffering and the scope of harmful consequences of forced psychiatry in a person's life. The severity of our subjective experiences of pain and suffering needs to be acknowledged. Too often we are disbelieved and our suffering is made to seem insignificant. In my presentation to the OHCHR expert meeting in 2007, I listed some of the immediate, long-term, and compound harms caused by forced drugging and electroshock and by psychiatric detention itself. And this did not actually address all the forms such as restraint and solitary confinement, but we can consider how much more that brings. A few of these are fear and terror, dissociation of mind from body, brain damage including memory loss and loss of cognitive skills, deprivation of privacy and subjection to the will of others, withdrawal syndrome from psychiatric drugs, diabetes and damage to organs such as liver, kidney, and thyroid, trauma reactions such as triggers and flashbacks, lack of social space to recover and heal from the trauma of forced psychiatry because it's endorsed by law in the medical profession, moral and spiritual crisis due to the encounter with cruelty and evil, and social and economic challenges to leaving the mental health system and securing independent housing and livelihood. This is related to discrimination in housing and employment and the inadequate standard of living on disability pensions, and finally, damage to relationships with family, friends, and community. And I'm sure we could all go on. For those of us in countries where forced psychiatry is widespread, this is the focal point of discrimination against people with psychosocial disabilities and a gaping wound that has to be cleaned out and healed so society as a whole can move forward together with us. Going on again to the next element in the criteria for torture, by or with the acquiescence of a public official. State responsibility for acts of torture extends both to acts carried out by public officials such as employees of public psychiatric institutions and to the state's complicity in authorizing by law and not taking effective measures to prevent acts of forced treatment and psychiatric detention carried out by private institutions or mental health professionals. Next, not inherent in lawful sanctions. This refers to criminal sanctions, and we should note that psychiatric detention and forced treatment are not inherent to punishment for a crime. Therefore, in the criminal context as well as in the civil context, detention in psychiatry or any kind of mental health facility and forced treatment are unjustified. And finally, for purposes such as obtaining a confession, coercion, intimidation, punishment, or reasons based on discrimination. The purpose of discrimination is satisfied, as we have seen, by the nature of forced psychiatry as having an aim of correcting or alleviating a disability against the person's will or without his or her free and informed consent. Other purposes are also present, although unacknowledged by the psychiatric profession. Coercion and intimidation occur not only incidentally as a means of carrying out the interventions, but as a purpose to change the person's behavior, and even further to change the person's consciousness and destroy the motivation for the behavior. This clearly goes against legal capacity, and it causes severe anguish to be aware that the alteration is happening in one's brain that inevitably affects consciousness, motivation, and behavior. Punishment happens more often than medical professionals would like to admit, and it is easy to see from any observation of the mental health system that psychiatrists heavily medicate individuals whom they do not like and whom they consider troublesome. In the United States, we have found that the use of all restrictive and coercive measures in psychiatry is done disproportionately against African Americans, which buys into and reflects negative attitudes and stereotypes toward people of color. It can also be said that the persistent effort of mental health professionals to get people to admit that they have a mental illness manifests the purpose of obtaining a confession. So there we have gone through all of the elements in the criteria for torture. It appears that they are all satisfied by the practice and system of forced psychiatry, and therefore they should be acknowledged as such. As actually the system and practice of forced psychiatry should be acknowledged as a system of torture and other ill treatment. And to be acknowledged actually as ill treatment, there is even a lower threshold than what I just went through in the criteria for torture. The Special Rapporteur on Torture acknowledged in 2013 that these practices and others dealt with in his report amount to ill treatment and arguably meet the criteria for torture. We hope the committee will build on this and on its jurisprudence to date under Article 15. And finally, I know I'm going very long, but I appreciate your staying with me. What can the committee do to utilize Article 15 most effectively to end impunity for torture in psychiatry? 1, take advantage of the synergy between the CRPD and the obligations relating to torture and ill treatment in international law that are incorporated into Article 15, either directly or by reference. Or not necessarily by reference, but by the fact that it's part of the international human rights system and is invoking that torture framework. In particular, obligations to effectively prevent as well as to prohibit and to punish acts of torture and ill treatment. These obligations fully apply to forced psychiatry and need to be asserted. They are complementary to the obligation to take positive measures to develop non-medical model support and to ensure that all mental health services are based on the free and informed consent of the person concerned. 2, utilize the framework of remedy and reparation as outlined by Hege in her presentation. This can be particularly effective and significant in the context of complaints and inquiries under the optional protocol, but it can also be very useful to incorporate this into concluding observations and then potentially in any future general comment. 3, monitoring mechanisms for the prevention of torture cannot effectively prevent torture in psychiatry unless they are applying the CRPD standards. Violations that are not obviously medical in nature, such as excessive heat and cold, rapes and assaults, are intimately bound up with the medical labeling and interventions in a system that is the modern and scientific manifestation of pervasive prejudice and exclusion of people with psychosocial disabilities. When monitoring mechanisms focus only on the non-medical violations and ignore or even approve of the medical violations like forced treatment and the detention itself, they are actually contributing to impunity and to the ongoing harm faced by people with psychosocial disabilities as a result. The committee should address this both in its concluding observation and through its interaction with relevant bodies to promote understanding not only of the CRPD but of the reasons for the profound paradigm shift in the CRPD. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.